1,000 days. That's how long Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has dragged on. 1,000 days into a war that was supposed to last just 3, and Russia finds itself in freefall. Ukraine, against all odds, has turned the tide, not just holding the line, but grinding Russia's military into dust. Staggering troop losses, shattered equipment, and crumbling morale paint a grim picture for the Kremlin. Putin's grand gamble has backfired spectacularly, and the cracks in his war machine are now impossible to ignore. But what sealed Russia's fate? The answer lies in a daring moment that reshaped the battlefield: the Kursk incursion. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine launched a surprise offensive into Russia's Kursk Oblast, catching Moscow completely off guard. Ukrainian forces quickly breached Russian defenses, capturing dozens of square miles of Russian territory within the first few days. By the end of the first week, Ukraine had secured around 386 square miles of land, and Russian authorities had been forced to declare a state of emergency. In other words, it took Ukrainian troops only a week to show the world just how fragile Russia's position truly is. Naturally, for Russia, this incursion was a humiliating blow. After all, we aren't talking about a border skirmish, we're talking about a full-scale breach into Russian territory. A breach that awarded Putin a not-so-flattering title: the first Russian leader in modern history to have foreign troops on Russian soil. However, the Ukrainian troops haven't been just holding ground, they've been inflicting serious damage on Russia's military infrastructure. Ukrainian artillery and drones have been hammering Russian positions, leaving a trail of destroyed vehicles, tanks, and equipment. But that's not even the worst part. Thousands of Russian soldiers have also been sent to an early grave, with each day claiming more of the country's already strained forces. To put it simply, it's a slaughter for Russia. A slaughter that shows no signs of slowing down. In fact, it only seems to be getting worse. The deadliest days for Russian troops are no longer early 2022 when the invasion first began. They're now in November 2024, as the battlefield becomes more unforgiving with every passing day. But words alone don't do justice to the scale of these losses. The numbers tell the true story of Russia's unraveling. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost 725,740 troops from February 24, 2022 to November 20, 2024. That's nearly 750,000 lives shattered in less than 3 years, and the toll keeps rising. As of November 20th, the deadliest day for Russian troops was November 11th, when they lost nearly 2,000 soldiers, or 1,950 to be precise. To put this into perspective, that's almost as many military personnel the United States lost during 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Yes, you heard that right. Between October 7, 2001 and August 30, 2021, the US suffered a total of 2,324 combat deaths. Russia nearly matched this number in casualties in just 24 hours. The scale of this bloodshed truly defies comprehension. But November 11th was no isolated incident. The record that was broken that day was set the day before, on November 10th, which was also reported as Russia's deadliest day since the beginning of the invasion, with 1,770 losses. The previous record, 1,740 Russian losses, was set on May 13th, mere days after Russia launched an offensive operation in Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast. But this doesn't mean that the early days of November were merciful for Russia. On November 8th, the country lost 1,660 troops. On November 4th, it was 1,260. November 1st claimed 1,270. You get the picture. October, previously the deadliest month for Russian forces, recorded 41,980 casualties, an average of roughly 1,350 per day. Yet November is shaping up to surpass even that grim milestone, with the last few days in November recording losses well over 1,500 a day. November 19th, 1,690. November 18th, 1,610. November 17th, 1,560. November 16th, 1,640. November 15th, 1,650. November 14th, 1,520. November 13th, 1,690. November 12th, 1,770. This devastation has led many to label what's unfolding in Kursk as nothing short of a massacre. Videos circulating online show hundreds of Russian vehicles obliterated, some with troops still inside. highlighting the utter futility of Moscow's repeated assaults. Of course, Russia wouldn't be Russia if it didn't try to spin things around. Russian soldiers have also been posting videos and photos of their battleground successes in Kursk. One such instance involves a Russian soldier proudly posing next to a Ukrainian Leopard 2 tank that his unit supposedly hit and captured. Given that Leopard 2 tanks are highly advanced and relatively scarce in Ukraine's arsenal, this was quite the achievement, right? Well, not quite. Upon closer inspection, this tank turned out to be nothing more than a decoy. A well-crafted decoy, but a decoy nonetheless. This bizarre display of desperation perfectly sums up the contrast between Russia's propaganda and the reality on the ground. This contrast has become so significant that Russian commanders have reportedly been arrested for exaggerating battlefield gains. According to recent reports, these arrests stem from Moscow's growing frustration with the gap between the glowing victories portrayed in state media and the catastrophic losses being suffered in Kursk. In a shocking turn of events, several mid-level and senior officers were accused of fabricating reports to appease higher-ups, overstating territorial gains and inflating Ukrainian losses. The goal of these false claims was to shield the commanders from criticism and disciplinary actions. However, they only managed to fuel the Kremlin's delusions about the state of the war. Yet another major miscalculation. So now, with Kursk turning into a disaster of unprecedented scale, the Kremlin's crackdown on its own commanders showcases the chaos and paranoia within Russia's military leadership. However, the fact that Russian commanders felt compelled to do this in the first place exposes another thing. The Russian chain of command is completely fractured. But as the Kursk debacle continues, no amount of doctor reports or arrests can mask the truth of Russia's mounting failures. But it's not just manpower that's being bled dry. Russia's equipment is also taking a brutal beating. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, as of November 20th, Russia has lost an astounding 9,390 tanks, 19,119 armored vehicles, and 20,681 artillery systems. These losses also extend to Russia's aerial and naval fleet, with 369 airplanes, 329 helicopters, and 28 ships and boats destroyed. Even drones, a crucial tool for modern warfare, haven't escaped unscathed. Over 19,202 Russian unmanned aerial vehicles have been taken out of action so far. November alone has added significantly to these staggering totals. In just one day, November 19th, Ukrainian forces reportedly took out 8 tanks, 27 armored personnel vehicles, 49 artillery systems, and 91 drones. And remember the deadliest day for the Russians, November 11th? Well, that single day claimed 23 tanks and 81 armored personnel vehicles. November added a couple more dismal milestones to Russia's depressing track record. As of November 20th, Russia has officially lost over 1,000 anti-aircraft systems. While Russia passed 4 digits in this department, it's quickly approaching a devastating 5-digit number in total. A total of 29,648 vehicles and fuel tanks have been lost so far, with November 19th adding another 100 to the tally. It's only a matter of time before Russia's vehicle losses surpass the mind-blowing 30,000 mark. Each new day seems to bring another chapter of devastation to Moscow's war effort, and the worst part is that Russia cannot possibly replace these vital resources at the pace required. Now, you might wonder, isn't Russia's economy on a war footing? With all the resources pouring into the defense industry, how is it possible that it can't keep up? Well, the answer is simple. The losses are just too big. Russia's production lines, stretched to their limits, simply can't match the ferocious pace of destruction. Take large-caliber cannon barrels, for instance. According to Oryx, a Dutch open-source intelligence defense analysis website that records documented equipment losses, Russia loses over 320 tank and artillery cannon barrels per month. However, Russia's 2 rotary forges, critical for producing these components, can churn out only 20 barrels monthly. That's a replacement rate of less than 7%. A catastrophic mismatch. Worse still, Russia can't expand its production capacity because the skills and equipment required are controlled by specialist firms abroad, such as Austria's GFM, and given the sanctions, the prospect of acquiring any necessary parts is close to zero. Fighting vehicles tell a similar story. Since the war began, Russia has lost roughly 155 infantry fighting vehicles, according to Oryx. Russian defense manufacturers can produce about 200 per year, or approximately 17 per month, which means they have the capacity to replenish these losses in less than a year. However, sustaining this level of production while also dealing with other categories of equipment losses and maintaining combat operations stretches Russian industry to its limits. Even with the older models scavenged from Soviet-era stockpiles, these reserves won't last indefinitely, raising questions about Russia's ability to keep up over the long term. Russia's artillery production has reportedly tripled to an annual rate of 3 million shells, which sounds impressive. Well, that is until you consider its consumption rate. While Russia is no longer firing the 12 million rounds expended in 2022, estimates suggest its current usage still far outstrips production. This has forced Moscow to rely heavily on imports, such as North Korean shells, which now make up nearly 50% of the artillery used in Ukraine. But shells aren't the only thing coming from North Korea. Beyond artillery, North Korea has provided long-range rocket and artillery systems, including 50 domestically produced 170mm M1989 self-propelled howitzers and 20 upgraded 240mm multiple-launch rocket systems. These contributions mark a deepening military partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang, one that shows just how destroyed Russia's defense capabilities are. However, North Korean contributions to the equipment department weren't the most controversial. North Korean troops have arrived in Russia too. As of early November, Pyongyang has deployed around 11,000 soldiers to bolster Russia's efforts in the Kursk Oblast. At the same time, reports suggest that this number could increase in the coming weeks. Divided into assault and support units, these North Korean forces are now integral to Russia's strategy in the region. Yet these troops face significant vulnerabilities. They're poorly trained and equipped, lack battle experience, and don't even understand the language spoken around them. That's why many military experts have labeled them as nothing more than cannon fodder for the Russians. Of course, their involvement speaks volumes about the sheer scale of Moscow's manpower losses. It's obvious that Putin is desperately trying to plug the gaps, as Russia's domestic recruitment and conscription efforts are failing to sustain the war. This makes the growing cooperation between Russia and North Korea far from the triumph Putin's propagandists might claim. No, this partnership reeks of desperation. Faced with battlefield attrition rates it can't match, and an economy teetering under the weight of war, Moscow has turned to one of the few nations willing to defy sanctions openly. Speaking of Russia's economy, it also has "finished" written all over it, just like Putin's efforts in Ukraine. Sure, on paper this economy might look solid. Russia's gross domestic product, GDP, is growing. Unemployment has hit a historic low of 2.4% and wages have skyrocketed. But this rosy picture hides severe structural problems, driven by the so-called military Keynesianism, an unsustainable, war-fueled economic boost. The defense industry alone has absorbed 500,000 workers, while the armed forces require 30,000 fresh recruits each month to replace casualties. The labor market is so strained that defense firms have had to increase wages five-fold, pushing inflation to 8.68% as of October. These increased wages might attract workers, but they still come at a steep cost. Other sectors, particularly those vital to the civilian economy, are suffering from acute labor shortages. Meanwhile, Moscow's lavish military bonuses have created a financial black hole that the civilian economy simply can't fill. Perhaps that's why the Kremlin has resorted to one of its most cynical moves yet, slashing compensation for wounded soldiers. In a November 13th decree signed by Putin, Russia introduced a sliding scale for injury payouts, cutting what was once a flat payment of roughly $30,000 for any injury to a drastically reduced amount based on the severity of the wounds. Under the new system, only soldiers with the most catastrophic injuries, classified as Section 1 and including severe spinal damage, brain trauma, or life-threatening organ damage, will receive the full $30,000 or 3 million rubles. For less severe but still debilitating injuries such as concussions or gunshot wounds not affecting organs, the payout drops to 1 million rubles or $10,000. And for truly minor injuries, soldiers will receive a paltry 100,000 rubles or roughly $1,000, barely enough to cover basic medical treatment. This cost-cutting measure is a flagrant betrayal of the soldiers who have already paid an immense price for Putin's war. Soldiers suffering from fractures or other injuries that may have long-lasting impacts on their lives are now treated as though their suffering doesn't matter. What was once a gesture of recognition for the hardships of war is now reduced to a cold, calculated formula. But the real sting comes when you consider the financial realities in Russia. With the rising inflation rate of 8% to 8.68%, even the 100,000 rubles for minor injuries will quickly lose their value. This means that the soldiers won't even be taken care of in the short term, let alone in the long run. For many, this is a painful reminder that they are seen as nothing more than expendable resources. However, for Russia, this miserly move was the only viable option, as the war's costs spiral out of control. A 2024 analysis estimated that casualty payouts alone could amount to 2.3 trillion rubles, which is equivalent to $26 billion. That's roughly 6% of the entire national budget. Faced with this financial hemorrhaging, Moscow is choosing to save rubles at the expense of the very people it sent to fight its war. But it gets worse. While the Kremlin trims compensation for injured troops, it continues to pour money into military bonuses. Lavish signing bonuses are swallowing resources that could otherwise be used to support those injured in service. Basically, Putin is sending a clear message to his people. You'll be paid handsomely to join, but once you leave, you're on your own. That's if you even get to leave. With this in mind, it's no wonder that morale has hit an all-time low among the Russian ranks. But unsurprisingly, Putin doesn't care. He's reportedly ordered the retake of Kursk at all costs. There's even a deadline for recapturing full control over the region, February 1, 2025. That's not even 2 weeks after the newly re-elected US President Donald Trump is set to be sworn into office. While the deadline was reportedly set up before Trump was re-elected, we can't help but wonder about the peculiar timing. With no regard for the lives of his soldiers, Putin is launching his forces forward with the same reckless abandon as at the start of the war. Column after column of Russian vehicles are pushing forward, charging headfirst into Ukraine's prepared defensive positions, despite the significant losses and strategic setbacks. So why the rush? Well, Putin is clearly trying to grab as much negotiating leverage as possible ahead of any potential diplomatic overture to the new US president. By regaining this territory, he will be able to present a victory of sorts to Trump, or at least a strong negotiating position to secure a deal that could be seen as a win for Moscow. But as you've already heard in this video, this all-out push isn't exactly going according to plan. And now, while President Joe Biden is still in office, the US has thrown a major wrench into Russia's plans. He's given Ukraine an all-clear to use US-supplied long-range missiles on Russian soil. This decision marks a monumental shift in the dynamics of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Biden's move, taken on November 17th, followed months of Ukrainian pleas for more potent weapons to strike Russian infrastructure and military targets beyond the front lines. At first, the US resisted providing such weapons for fear of escalating the conflict. However, Moscow's provocative actions, especially the deployment of North Korean soldiers among the 50,000 troops in Kursk, finally prompted a change in Washington's stance. The immediate impact of this policy change was felt just 2 days later, on November 19th, when Ukrainian forces reportedly launched an ATACMS missile against a key Russian munitions storage facility in Karachev, Bryansk Oblast. This attack marked the first time that the US-supplied long-range missiles were used on Russian soil. The target, a vital arsenal of Russia's main missile and artillery directorate, was reportedly destroyed in a dramatic explosion that sent fireballs soaring into the sky. Residents even captured the moment on video, showing the scale of the blast that rocked the region. Ukrainian officials confirmed that the munitions stored at this facility included artillery ammunition and anti-aircraft missiles, which are critical supplies for Russia's ongoing offensive. But why is this strike seen as a turning point in the war? Well, the ATACMS, with a range of up to 190 miles, allows Ukraine to target high-value Russian assets far from the front lines. The weapon's precision and capability to strike so deep within Russian territory will undoubtedly put immense pressure on Moscow's military infrastructure. However, it's important to note that this isn't just about military targets. It's about crippling Russia's ability to resupply its forces and sustain operations across multiple fronts, and this strike is just the beginning. The US decision has allowed Ukraine to incorporate long-range capabilities from other NATO allies, including France and the UK, into its arsenal. These nations are now preparing to send their own long-range missiles to Ukraine, which notably include the Storm Shadow missiles, with a range of 310 miles. These missiles are designed to be launched from fighter jets, further increasing the diversity and reach of Ukraine's strikes within Russian territory. Other NATO allies are likely to follow suit. This means that Russia, which had become accustomed to operating with relative impunity on its own soil, will now be vulnerable to direct attacks that can cripple its logistics, command centers, and military resources. For Putin, this represents a nightmare scenario, a war on two fronts, one in Ukraine and one within his own borders. Moscow's response to this new reality has been predictably hostile. Russian officials, including Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov, have described the US decision as a dangerous escalation and a new phase of direct US involvement in the conflict. Peskov even warned that this would lead to greater tension between Russia and the West. As for Putin, he did what he does best: resort to the good old nuclear saber-rattling. This time, he dramatically lowered Russia's threshold for using nuclear weapons. Previously, Russia's nuclear doctrine allowed for the use of nuclear weapons only in case of a nuclear attack or an existential conventional attack, one that threatened the very survival of the state. However, the new doctrine now states that Russia could respond with nuclear weapons to any critical threat to its sovereignty and territorial integrity, even if the threat comes in the form of a conventional attack. This also includes situations where Russia's ally Belarus is attacked, or if a non-nuclear power, with support from a nuclear-armed state, engages in acts of war against Russia. Essentially, any attack by a NATO member or a joint attack involving NATO support could be deemed as an attack on Russia itself, thereby triggering the potential use of nuclear weapons. Of course, the timing of this decree is no coincidence. Putin wanted to make it clear that he views Biden's decision as a direct threat to Russia's security. The Kremlin has long warned that if NATO provided Ukraine with weapons capable of reaching Russian territory, it would consider NATO's involvement in the conflict as direct. In response, Russia wouldn't hesitate to escalate the situation. However, these repeated threats have always been just that – threats, empty words. This makes Putin's reaction just another desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of control over a situation that has increasingly slipped from his grasp. But unless nuclear weapons truly enter the game, Russia is, as it stands, finished. It's losing troops, equipment, and money at an unprecedented rate. Now, with the capability for long-range strikes in Ukrainian hands, it will also lose territory and infrastructure. In other words, it's truly game over. But what do you think? Is Russia truly done? Or will it find a way to turn the tide? Will the West continue to provide the necessary support to Ukraine? Or will the recent changes in the US leadership begin to fracture the coalition? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.